My name is Brian Brinker, and I will be discussing State of Utah versus Jeffrey McIntyre Roberts. This is an appeal to a conviction of theft by deception, and what I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of the initial trial and the appeal, and give you an idea of what took place and the facts of the trial and what led to the appeal. And then I'd like to discuss what the core of this appeal is, and that is the establishment of the essential elements of the crime of theft by deception and how those are used to prove his conviction. The initial trial took place in the 4th District Court of Utah County. This was a trial by jury, and they convicted Mr. Roberts of theft by deception. Mr. Roberts promises Mrs. Marlowe that he will take her $38,000 to Brazil to purchase some gold through a contact of his at a low price, and he will return to the United States and sell that gold for a large profit, and this will effectively double Mrs. Marlowe's initial investment. Mr. Roberts, Mrs. Marlowe requires Mr. Roberts to secure her $38,000, and so he volunteers to sign over a deed to some property that he owns, which is valued at approximately $38,000. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Marlowe at the time, there were liens against that property for $26,000, and she does find this out after she signs the deed. And once she does find this out, she has some trouble contacting Mr. Roberts, and eventually turns this into the state attorney's office, which then makes this go to trial. The jury convicts him based on the fact that Mr. Roberts never intended to go to Brazil and never intended to purchase the gold. He basically just put this into his bank account and began spending it. And at the same time, he was able to dump off some land that he owed money on to Mrs. Roberts, and that was as far as he was going to go. And Mrs. Roberts did not receive any return on that investment. He argues that this was basically just a sale of property. He received $38,000 for some land that was worth $38,000, and so Mrs. Marlowe really suffered no loss, and she now owns the land, and so they're not able to convict him of this crime. The jury disagrees and convicts him of theft by deception, and at the end of the trial, he makes a motion for the judge to instruct on the essential element of pecuniary loss. Pecuniary in this case just means monetary loss. The judge denies that motion, and that leads us to the appeal. Most appeals would go to the appellate courts, but the fact that this case questions the essential elements of the state statute, this upgrades the jurisdiction to the Supreme Court of Utah. Mr. Roberts has 2 points of appeal. His first point of appeal is that pecuniary loss is an essential element to the crime, and that in the initial trial they failed to provide sufficient evidence that Mrs. Marlowe suffered any monetary loss based on the fact that she received property valued at the amount of cash she had given up. Assuming that this is true, the judge is required to instruct on the essential elements of the crime, and since he failed to instruct on the essential element of pecuniary loss, he performed a reversible error. And this is an error that is sufficient enough to affect the outcome of the trial or affect the jury's decision, and this would allow Mr. Roberts to have his conviction reversed. Mr. Roberts also uses State of Utah versus Johnson to support the pecuniary loss being an essential element of the crime of the state statute 76-6-405. The court rules that pecuniary loss is not an essential element to the crime of theft by deception, and therefore, according to Mr. Roberts' second appeal, the judge did not commit a reversible error by failing to instruct. They use many cases to support their findings, but the State of Utah versus Walton is one that they use to prove that pecuniary loss is not essential to the crime. So we have the initial trial, which is basically Mr. Roberts deceiving Mrs. Marlowe which results in her being deprived of her $38,000 and not receiving any return on her investment as promised. She also does acquire some land in the process from Mr. Roberts. And then we have the appeal that Mr. Roberts is appealing that they did not prove theft by deception based on the fact that the essential element of pecuniary loss was not proven. And that leads us to getting into theft by deception and the essential elements and what the court sees versus what Mr. Roberts sees. We have, first I'll go ahead and read the state statute. A person commits theft if the person obtains or exercises control over property of another person by deception and with a purpose to deprive the other person of property. The theft by deception does not occur when there is only falsity as to matters having no pecuniary significance. So the first part is stating that in order to commit theft by deception, the defrauder has to present a false claim or a false promise to the victim. And that false promise is what influences the victim to be deprived of their property or their money in this case. And the victim is doing this, relying on this promise, thinking that they're going to receive the promised outcome in return for their money. The second part basically says theft does not occur when falsity as to matters having no pecuniary significance. And the American Law Institute actually gives an example of this and sort of provides a scenario in which this would actually be used. So if a car salesman fabricates an affiliation with a religious group to garner favor with a customer who is affiliated with that religious group, you could argue that if that customer buys the car, they have been deceptively deprived of their money, but you can't argue that it's been done criminally because they came into that agreement with the intent of being deprived of their money in order to obtain a vehicle. And if that person paid the amount of money that they expected to pay and they received the vehicle that they wanted, they did not suffer pecuniary loss under a false pretense or under a false promise. They got what they bargained for. So there was deception, but it did not result in any pecuniary loss that was gained through or caused by a deceptive act. This person received the car that they bargained for. So that goes back to the first part, where when a person is deprived of their property and they do not receive what they bargained for based on a promise that had false intent, that is when the crime is committed. So that is the essential element of the crime. The person must be deceived, the defrauder must gain control over that person's property, and their intent is to deprive that person of their property. Their intent is not to carry out their end of the deal. So Mr. Roberts uses State of Utah versus Johnson because in that ruling they include pecuniary loss as an essential element of the crime. But in that ruling, when they list that as an essential element, they essentially provide that either the first part of the statute must take place, the person must be deprived of their property through deception, and they must not have received what they bargained for, or they suffer pecuniary loss. And the key word here is or. They must have one or the other. So if the person does not receive what they bargained for, it sort of makes the other one irrelevant. It makes the fact that they did not suffer any loss, it doesn't matter. That's secondary. And so that occurs in the court's example of Utah versus Walton, where the victim actually does suffer both parts of the crime. They suffer pecuniary loss, but they also entered into an agreement under false pretenses, and they were deprived of their property and did not receive what they bargained for. And due to that, the fact that they lost money was really only secondary. It just helped prove the first part of the crime. So the court establishes that in most cases, prior cases, the pecuniary loss is never required as an essential element. And the Utah versus Johnson case is actually kind of a one-off. And so the gist of this crime is that Mrs. Marlowe entered into an agreement and was deprived of her property based on the fact that she was expecting to receive a return on her investment monetarily. And the fact that she gained property worth $38,000 is really secondary to this. That's not what she bargained for. She would not have entered this agreement if it were strictly a land sale. So that's what upheld the conviction, and Mr. Marlowe, or Mr. Roberts, was guilty of the crime. So what we see is the importance of understanding the elements of a crime and understanding how they've been used prior to the case that you're in. In this case, pecuniary loss being used before. I think in most cases it was not used as an essential element. It was used either to disprove deception being a crime, or it was used in support of the essential elements of being deprived of your property through a false intent. And perhaps Mr. Roberts' lawyer was not very good, or did not have a good understanding of this, and that played a role in the outcome for Mr. Roberts. And so I think it's important to be able to obtain the best lawyer that you can, and to have hopefully that lawyer has a good understanding of how the elements were used prior to your case, and also how the judges are going to use those elements in the case at hand. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of this case, and also theft by deception and the elements that make that up, and how those elements can be used in this conviction. So thank you very much, and have a good day.